So, for tonight, tonight was kind of like a hard one over the course of the week because the thing that God kept talking to me about was trust. And the gist of it is this, is that there's this issue that every person seems to have where it comes down to trusting in one thing or another. And it doesn't matter like where you come from or what you believe. Your trust will be buried in one thing or the other, and oftentimes it's in ourselves. Like at the end of the day, the thing that we all are kind of like raised with to believe in is that the one person that you can trust and believe in is you. Which is ironic because like first year psychology, you'll find out that the first hurdle that you have to deal with when you're talking to somebody, counseling them or working with them psychologically, is that one of the three major issues with human memory is delusion. So
sounds about right.
The facts are that our recourse is to believe in ourselves, but the truth is that we delude ourselves routinely. So it puts us in kind of a weird, paradoxical circumstance where we keep angling for one specific thing and going back to one specific thing because at times it's proven that to be true. We've been able to, like, nobody buys into something unless it has worked at some point or another. And yet, because we have that one time that it's been confirmed, we keep going back to it over and over and over again, even if it's only been confirmed one time. So to give an example, there was an old friend of mine who desperately believed that he was like a salesman. So and at one point he had a job that he actually did okay at in terms of sales. Terrible personality. Like, I remember distinctly telling him that, like, abruptly I told him, I was like, look, if you were my salesman, I would intentionally not buy whatever you were selling me. Even if I had shown up to the store with the intention of buying said item, I would refuse to buy it because of who you are.
Oh my gosh.
This is your friend?
Yes.
Sure.
Damn, dude. That's
Why don't you
rough.
just explain the characteristics that you became alarmed about
So
coming out of
the
him?
characteristics of this person, just to be clear, were that he was extremely pushy, extremely arrogant. And when I say extremely, I'm talking on a scale of 1 to 10, 10. 10 throughout. So he was... I record this stuff. Shut up. Anyway, the thing of it is that, you know, I distinctly had to have this conversation with him many, many times because what he was holding on to was this belief that he was this person. Even though every job that he got after that was commission-based and he got fired every single time. It was just this, and it was like a revolving door. He would get a job in sales, specifically on the grounds that I can do great at this, and then he wouldn't, and he'd get fired. And as a result of that, he'd keep running into this thing, and he'd just go back and get another job in the same boat. Until finally he didn't, and he actually lasted for a little while. But it was this thing where he just couldn't understand, he couldn't listen, because the delusion that he held on to was that he was this person. And the reason why that delusion existed was because he had at one point achieved success here, a little bit. So he trusted firmly in this idea of who he is, and refused to let go of it, even though all the evidence to the contrary was mounting up and mounting up and mounting up. He still just held on to the same thing, even though it was just a tiny, tiny little thing. And that's the power of belief and the power of trust, is that they can take us into these kinds of places. even just to like give a couple little definitions. And the reason why like I'll interchange belief and trust a lot because they have interchangeable parts. And I looked up the definition specifically to give a basis for that so that we can be clear as to why. The definition of belief is an acceptance that a statement is true or that something exists. And we'll pause for a moment for the passers.
Say the definition again.
Okay. The definition of belief is an acceptance that a statement is true or that something exists.
Okay.
It can also be defined as trust, faith, or confidence in someone or something.
Yeah.
Trust is defined as a firm belief, or rather, firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. So, just to be specific about the words here, it's why I'm kind of going to interchange them a little bit.
What's the big difference? I guess.
Effectively, it's in specificity. Like, trust specifically denotes something or someone, whereas belief doesn't necessarily have to have that. Belief
I
is more
see.
broad.
Okay.
But they have kind of like the same basic principle of like, your trust is here,
Yeah.
or your belief is here.
Like everybody believes in the law, but not everybody follows it. Exactly, or accepts it. Strikers. It's important.
So,
How did you know?
I want to do it.
I lived there. I had a huge window.
so talking about this particular subject, you know, it's hard because there are a lot of different things that we kind of live on in faith and that we believe in. And I think one of the hard things with us is that it's always, what we look for ultimately is something that makes us feel confident and comfortable in this life and existence. Oftentimes it comes down to having a sense of control on the basis of what we have available to us and what we know, what we can basically grab onto things and hold on to them. Take for instance, like science. I remember when I was studying to be a zoologist, I was taught very specifically that everything falls into the five senses. So if you can't, your explanations have to fall within those grounds. And yet, there's a lot of things in science that we can't actually totally explain so easily. There's a lot of stuff, especially when we talk about space or paleontology, even elements of biology that are more or less still kind of revolving around the world of theory. Theory being something that we can prove to a point, but it's not a law yet because it still maintains the basis of being proven over and over and over again. The hypothesis has been proven to a point, so it becomes theory, and then it has to go through rigorous testing before it becomes a law. The trouble is that there are a lot of theories, and we accept them as truth. A friend of mine once put it very well in saying that he looks at theories as being, this is what we understand things to be right now. This is truth for right now.
Progressive type truth, like
Yeah,
doing the best we can with what we know.
exactly. So the thing with it was that, you know, when we look at science, we find something that a lot of us gravitate towards. And it's a lot of our culture. I mean, we're a Western civilization tends to denote this kind of logic-based format of explaining the world. And yet we still find things that we have trouble with. And a lot of us, we tend to lump those into pseudoscience. But even then, the trouble with this is that because our belief ends up revolving around this, we can create circumstances that ultimately are very much so like a religion or are destructive in this context. To give an example, if my words are not really on point enough, there's currently a thing going around called the descent from Darwinism. Effectively, what it is it's a large number of biologists, ecologists, scientists of various different forms who are effectively standing back and saying, okay, Darwin's theory of evolution is not enough to explain why things work the way they work. And this comes after years of this being a kind of like underlying thing in the scientific community. But basically, a lot of people were quiet about it for a long time because they were afraid of losing their jobs. If you came up against this theory, you would be fired. You couldn't work at a college, you couldn't work at a number of different places unless you adhered to this belief, which wasn't fair, and it also was kind of counter to the nature of science and being something that's supposed to be changeable as they quest for and search for the truth. So presently this thing's been going around and it's become kind of a quiet struggle in the scientific community. You don't see a lot of articles about it, but they are there. And eventually it reached its breaking point a few months back when a large number of scientists and so on finally just said, okay, we're done. Here's our written thing, here are our signatures. We're saying we're done with this for now. We want to look into something else and figure this out more.
Is this the Galapagos tortoise or the Galapagos Islands experiment thing that you did, or what was this? The evolution thing?
So it was Darwin's theory of evolution. Like, that's what they're effectively moving away from. So there are parts where they're finding issues with that. And it's a lot more specific than I can really get into right now. But if you want, I could find I've got one saved that I was trying to read through. It's just been finding time. But this ends up being one example where we kind of like hold on to this thing as true. Another example that we run into is, to be more specific to Christians. You know, last week I talked about, I said something that would have me flagged for heresy and blasphemy and so many other things. I questioned the infallibility of the scriptures. So the thing of that is that in this same vein, when we talk about things, that constructs that we develop and we believe in and accept as truth, we find ourselves in that same place. See, the Bible in and of itself, being the book that it is, it's helpful for Christians, especially since it holds all these stories and so on, as well as a lot of information about God and his character, about Jesus. We have the Gospels. But the problem with it is that we have this kind of idea that says, okay, it's either all true or none of it's true. So I always found this funny because growing up, I read nothing but nonfiction. From the point when I could actually read to about the time that I was 25, it was just endlessly reading either science, history, or more science. And the thing that was always frustrating was that I would run into books all the time as I was reading them, and they would have facts wrong. You know, the Eyewitness book would say that, you know, this information about this shark, and I would just be like, well, I know that that's not true because I read these 5 other books that say this is true. And then at the same time, we run into things having to be updated with time. Information comes and goes. For instance, Komodo dragons, for the longest time, were believed to have bacteria that would cause death whenever they bit something. And more recently, it was discovered that they have venom glands, but they don't look like typical venom glands. So they produce venom, and that's what does the killing. So there's this kind of like groundwork of this. And I've always found it interesting that the Bible has that specific stigma. But I always remember when, you know, one of the things that God specifically took me into was to talk about that and to kind of commit a degree of iconoclasm pertaining to the Bible as it had become something that Christians worship. I thought it was interesting. I forgot the book now, but earlier there was a book that I've been reading by A.W. Tozer, and he made a comment about how the church, and he wrote this book in the 50s, or 60s, I mean, but he talked about how the church in a lot of ways, their view of God was no different and maybe even less significant than the views that the Greeks and Romans had of their gods. God was no more real has been no more real to the church than those stories, than those gods. And sometimes even less so, because we don't grant him any belief in his strength or power or anything like that. So it's been this thing where the Bible has become like a replacement for God and brought us into a faith that it's not real. Like, it's all about what you can do, what you can put in. It's all about your efforts, your actions, all these different things. It's not about the relationship that's supposed to be so significant that you learn about from the scriptures. Instead, it's twisted into a bunch of acts of commitment. So it's not real. It's not what any of the writers of the epistles or the letters or anything like that were going for or even discussing. Instead, it's been bastardized into this, like,
Way of life.
a way of life, yeah,
Yeah.
that revolves around a set of rules. So it's been this thing where people put their faith into that. And even when they talk about their fruit and the things that they exhibit, the changes in behavior, the transformation that they go through, it's just them acting differently. It's not even them really being a different person. It's just they put on that face for everybody around them. But they put faith and they put trust and belief in this book to make them a better person, even though it's all just a show. And they don't actually have any legitimate trust in God. All that they have is a trust in their ability to take control of themselves and act in such and such a way. And even for people who have relationship with God, just to like remove all of the possible things here, it's still not any better. Like, I know for myself, whenever God tells me something, my usual response is to be like, well, we'll see. Like, I can sit back and think of countless times where God has shown me things, told me things, or even like shown me future events, and then I got to watch them happen. And even still to this day, even though it's been 7 years of that, to this day I still have that same reservation where I stand back and say, well, I guess we'll see what happens. Yeah. So the question that we ultimately come back to is, what do we really trust? And do we really have all the answers? And is it fair to actually stand up and try to claim that we have all the answers? So we'll stop here for a moment and take a break, and then come back.
Yeah, I was thinking about.
So, to kind of continue on with this, this question of trust, and what do we trust in? And even to go, we find ourselves with a lot of situations, and even like kind of playing that role of iconoclast, you tear apart a lot of the ground that people think that is very steady. People don't like that. I mean, you're effectively taking away the things that they've grown accustomed to finding comfort in. And people don't like to be uncomfortable. So, but at the same time, the intention is not to just like throw everything into disarray and chaos, as that's never the point with anything that God does. Even when chaos comes, it is indeed to bring back some semblance of something. A lot of people get put into kind of what we call desert seasons, which are basically difficult times where they find themselves feeling alone or feeling tested constantly as trial after trial comes and passes, and they're left to kind of react to it. And even though these feel like chaotic and lonely times, the intention is always just to create an opportunity for people to, utilize what they've learned or to draw closer to God. And even in the aftermath of them, he'll usually, what I've experienced and seen is him drawing people back. But the thing of it is in this particular instance, to kind of continue on, when we look at the things that we trust in, whether they're people, institutions, other gods, ideologies, or even just ourselves, plainly and simply, as there are plenty who just have that and nothing else. We're always going to find flaws in all of them. Nothing's perfect. And the irony is in that some of the ones that can seem the most comfortable is that they oftentimes give the most, they're the most flexible. You can basically make it into whatever you want. And the truth is what we find is that a lot of that is pertinent to, modern Christianity. A lot of people build God to look in their own image, or in the image of what they think he should be. Should God be overly difficult? Should be hard? Should be complicated? Even reading that book earlier, the descriptions of him as being so, it described God's character as being so unapproachable and so incomprehensible. And even though there's truth to that, a lot of people use that to create a God that they can't know, that isn't interested in any of the things that we find him being interested in. Last week, I talked about God's character and that the biggest thing that matters to him is relationship, and that he is a relational being who seeks relationship. I mean, in the Gospels, we read the story about Jesus sweating blood when he was getting ready to go to the cross. And a lot of people have given a lot of weird examples of why he did that, but it's explained, in Hebrews, and even he himself denotes the fact that it's the one time when Jesus was going to be separated from God. Like, the level of stress necessary to bleed sweat, or to sweat blood, is it's overwhelming. Like, that's not, even when people are going through like really heightened cases of anxiety, it still takes a lot of stress to create that effect.
Is that even possible, or is that miraculous?
No, it's a medical thing.
Okay.
That's why we know how hard it is. Like, the level of duress has to be so incredibly high that before the human body to do that. But the thing that we run into with that story particularly is it highlights the fact that for the first time, Jesus was going to be separate from God, the Father. And, when we understand the idea of, the Trinitarian view that, Jesus and God, the Father and the Holy Spirit are all one being, it's effectively the same idea as having a part of yourself cut off for a moment. Even though you're going to get it back, it was still completely cut off, which is part of why there was so much duress there. And I highlight that to denote the nature of the relational nature of God, and how significant that was to him, how significant that is to him, how much that matters. So, understanding this, and the fact that everything's intended to bring people back to relationship, oftentimes we do have to look at things for what they are. These things that we believe in, these things that we do trust in, and determine whether they're going to pull us closer into relationship, or if they're going to hold us back. And that's the biggest thing that happens. It's why so many times we have these kinds of things crushed. Even when, to go back to the Bible, and like specifically that subject. And when God specifically told me about the Bible as being something that people believe in him over, or believe in over him, how basically what he told me at that point in time years ago was that he told me that the Bible had become an idol. And sure enough, I find stories, weirdly, that just happened to come to me over the course of that week of, you know, back in the early days when early Christians would have councils, they would take the seat at the head of the table and they would place a Bible on that seat as a symbol that the Holy Spirit was there with them, or that God was presiding over this meeting.
I'm sorry, that shouldn't be funny.
Oh,
It is.
it is a little.
Pretend friends.
It's just that, you know, the thing about it is that the Bible is a book. Like, before the Bible was compiled by the Council of Nicaea, it was separated into a bunch of letters, and then even the Old Testament itself was a completely different book, which had some extra things in it that was decided to be pulled out or were added in later. I get a little confused. I've heard a lot of conflicting reports about the composition. The point is that, you know, this thing was put together for a purpose of like helping Christians. It wasn't put together with the intention of being worshipped or replacing God. And one of the stories he brought me to, fittingly enough, out of the Bible to kind of exemplify what this was that even though God gives good things, they become bad things when they start to become worshipped. And the example that he gave me was the bronze serpent, which was, you find the story of it in Numbers 21. And to kind of go through it a little bit, starting in verse 4. Yeah. It talks about how the Israelites were circling the desert, and they began to like come against God. So venomous snakes were sent to deal with this as a punishment. And people would get bit and died. And when they called out to God, he had Moses make a serpent out of bronze, which they could touch, and they would be healed of the venom of whatever bit them. So they carried around this big bronze serpent, and they would use this in order to be healed of snake bites. But years and years later, when you get into the reign of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, you know, this was after Moses and his people had settled, the Israelites had taken over Israel, and then even then it got separated because it was attacked by, I believe it was the Babylonians, or no, it was the Assyrians, who took out the northern half of Israel, and so you were just left with Judah. Hezekiah became king in Jerusalem, and in 2 Kings 18, it tells the story of how Hezekiah himself broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made. For up to that time, the Israelites had been burning incense to it, and they named it Nehushtan. Basically, the point was that, you know, he had them do this thing, this item that they were able to use, and he'd empowered it. And even then, people took it and applied their trusts, and belief became such that they began to worship it, to the point that this king later had to come up and destroy it in order to free them from that particular idol and from holding on to that. And it becomes necessary sometimes for God, in order to continue to bring people into relationship with him, to remove these things that blind them. So it ended up being that kind of thing. So we come back to the infallibility of Scripture thing. If something is perfect, then it's worthy of worship. That's just the way that we think of things. Like, whether that's logical, reasonable, intelligent in any way, shape, or form doesn't matter, because we're not always rational beings.
Yeah.
So, having to deal with that, you find yourself kind of running into that. Which draws us back to this earlier point about trust in ourselves. One of the biggest issues that we run into, like I said earlier, talking about the thing that we have a tendency to delude ourselves, is we tend to grab for things that work. It doesn't matter what it is, if it has any semblance of function, we'll grab onto it and say that this is something that I can trust in. In science, like when I was learning in that regard, things had to be before they were trustworthy, they had to be proven multiple times. It's actually been a problem for me at different times talking to people or working with people at different jobs and things like that, where it's like they come up with a solution to a problem, and it's like, okay, but that might not work every time. It worked once, and then they try it again and it doesn't work, and then they're mad at me because they feel like I was gloating about it. And sometimes maybe I was, but that's beside the point.
You never.
Sometimes. The point is that, we come back to that subject of like what we call confirmation bias, where we kind of like grab onto things that affirm what we already believe. So if my trust is put into something that might have flaws in it, then I'm going to look for reasons to continue to believe in whatever it is. Even though there's a mountain of evidence against it, I'm still leeching on to whatever I can in order to prove myself right, because if I lose this little bit semblance of stability that I have, that's terrifying. And I think that kind of draws us to a lot of the point of tonight's message, that sometimes it's okay to be terrified, and sometimes it's okay to feel like you don't have steady ground to stand on. It's not comfortable, it's scary, but sometimes it's important. There was a song that we listened to, and I had no idea that it was going to be pertinent to this, but here it is. It was a new song put out by this obscure band that I only happened to end up listening to. But they just happened to put out this new song today, and the end of the song, the singer talks about, or keeps reciting the lines about all good things come to an end, but it's not an end, it's a new beginning. And the problem that we run into is we always treat these things like they're the end of the world. If this thing that I'm counting on goes wrong, then my whole world's going to fall apart. And the truth is that the more that you build yourself around something like that, something that you can control, something that basically just reflects you, yeah, sure. Because the truth of humanity is that as individuals, our perceptions, our characters, we change on a routine basis. If you look at yourself 10 years ago and consider your character at that point in time, you'll most likely find that you're a fairly different person from who you were 10 years ago. And if you had a means to do it and look 10 years forward, I'll bet you cash and prizes that you're going to be a very different person again.
Yeah, you're right, because like one time, when MySpace was around, look at my old like messages, and it's like, whoa, who am I?
I was an
What
asshole.
was I?
Still am.
Talking to these people from high school, like, or
Yeah.
just out of high school,
Yeah.
differently.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's MySpace is a dark place for some of us.
Well, I haven't, that was like, what, 10 years ago when last time I checked.
Yeah, yeah. So, the thing of it is that this kind of unsteady ground and being comfortable with things changing on us and being okay, not comfortable. Being okay with things changing can be a difficult thing, because I can distinctly recall times where it's felt like I've just kind of been like stuck in a river and being sucked down it. And I'm in the middle of it and it's curving and there are rapids and all these different things, and I don't have any control. And I think that's another thing I know it's another thing that we have to learn, is to be comfortable not having control over everything. And that's why this subject of trust ends up being so significant. Because where your trust is placed will determine your ability to handle those times of instability and those times of chaos, and especially those times when you do not have control. Because they will come. I guarantee you will face many of them, and there will be nothing you can do about it.
You don't say.
And the thing of it is that that's where we end up coming into an issue of, so if you're there, where then do you find your strength? In yourself? Sure. I can't.
That's worked so many times before.
Exactly. I can't tell you how many times I've reverted back to grabbing on to my way of doing things in the midst of these moments of chaos, and it exploded in my face in the most horrifying of ways. And then I thought, oh, I'll learn from that by controlling it better this way.
Right.
And then that fell apart. I can distinctly remember a time right after, when I was going to college, when it was just this constant feeling of that my world was falling apart over and over and over again, and I would work my ass off to rebuild it. And then it would crumble again. So for 2 years, that was life. And I couldn't learn from it because I was so stuck in my own way of thinking. And that's when I went and joined the army, which was another mistake on top of mistakes. That was my panic button to take control. So, that in and of itself being another story. The point is that where do we go? If we can't grab a hold of this thing and make it work the way we want, no matter how hard we try, what do we do? Where do we find stability? Where do we find strength? And there are two places. There are two places where we can find strength. One is in those around us. There was an interesting dialogue that we happened to watch the other night, Heather and I. We were watching an old episode of House. And, House is a character, for those maybe unaware, the one or two people, is purely misanthropic. He doesn't want to be around people. He doesn't want to trust people, ever. Because the idea of trusting people is terrifying. If you trust them, they'll lie to you. And that will hurt. And he was talking to this guy who was a senator. And the senator came from a similar background as House. The difference was he had taken the opposite approach. Was I would rather trust in people and believe in something and be disappointed.
Yeah.
Because I can, at least if I provide the opportunity, maybe I won't be disappointed next time. And it was an interesting paradigm, because the truth is a lot of people who struggle with trust rely on themselves because they feel that the only person that they can rely on is themselves. Either by experience or circumstance or a collection of lots of different things, they've come to accept the idea that I cannot trust anybody in this room because I know that everybody in this room will betray me, lie to me, fail me, and whatever else under the sun. And the funny thing about that is that they usually have a mountain of evidence to prove that. I know back in the day, like that has been me at different points in time. And I was proven right every time. But the thing of it is that, you know, through time with God and Him effectively coaching me, I've had to open myself up to this experience, the other side of this, which was believing despite the risk of disappointment. And the thing that I can say, the reason why this stood out to me, was that the senator's view was one that is hopeful, whereas House's view was one that is afraid. So we find ourselves with this paradigm that says I either function in fear and reserve and protect myself from damage, or I function in hope and risk damage. It's not easy either way. The point is that one of them will provide you opportunities in life that will challenge your perceptions and even potentially provide you the complete opposite of everything that you've experienced so far. If it hadn't been for that shift in my personal paradigm, I never would have developed the friends that I've developed. I never would have had the friends that I've had. Instead, I would still be alone and quiet and probably putting creepy messages on Facebook just because it's all that I knew.
I would still marry you.
Yeah.
My creepy little love.
Yeah.
Maybe you ask her to do
Thank
it
you.
for you.
That is good.
Thank you for that.
You're making
You
me
can
sick.
trust in me.
It's library. Shh.
What's up?
Shh. It's library.
This beer's here too, though. It's great.
So, secondary thing is, so just to kind of like expound on that one thing a little bit more, is that trusting in people. You know, we've talked a lot about that actually in this group. When we talked about the Office series, or when we went through the Office series specifically, there was a big portion of it revolved around community and what community can be, or what it should be. And even though it's idealized, there's no reason why we can't have that. You know, it's a funny thing because when we talk about the ideal of, okay, let's have a community that actually cares about each other and works together in order to try to take care of each other, does that seem like an impossible goal or something that's actually cannot happen? Well, no, of course not. It would be ludicrous to believe that that's impossible. Even though it's difficult, it's not impossible. And in that particular regard, it's not something that should not be believed in or trusted in as a possibility. And the biggest thing is at some point, you know, somebody has to effectively drop their guard and say, okay, I'm going to trust you with me and my care and my person. And even though I know that you'll fail me, at some point or another, I'm still going to offer this because it's the only way that we grow. And then somebody else has to say the same thing, and back and forth and through and through. This is when it changes from being a discussion of what's possible to an application. And it becomes a point of saying, okay, here I am. And I'm going to trust in you guys to do this thing. And the truth is that you'll come to find once people start dropping their guard, one, you find a lot of common ground because a lot of people go through the same problems. They've just been quietly hoarding them to themselves, thinking that they were weird. And two, you'll find that, again, you'll be challenged in a lot of ways because if you didn't believe in people, you might find that you can. And even though there will be disappointments, sometimes you can get past those based sheerly off of how far these people have gone with you and how much they've cared about you. And it's easy to overlook, that one time when they didn't answer your phone call or, whatever, because they've been your brother or your sister through some of your worst times. And that begins to kind of like change it. That's something that can draw us out of anxiety, out of depression, out of a lot of different things. These kinds of psychological things that we hold on to, or rather that hold on to us, get a lot harder as they get challenged over and over and over again. And what I mean by that is it gets harder for them to hold us down. We'll go ahead and take another break before I finish off the message, just so people can go to the bathroom and whatnot. So, like I was saying, there were two things that we find that we can have trust in. And just to be clear about something, this isn't to say that you should not have trust in your own perception. It is to say that it shouldn't be the end-all be-all, okay? Like, it hasn't been intentional to say you should never ever trust yourself, because sometimes your instincts are extremely important. You can have a whole group of people saying one thing about you and be wrong, and you can know that, and that happens. Just as much as you can have a whole group of people be saying something that's completely right about you and you don't see it and you're wrong. It's not, there's no like black and white clear thing here, okay? Which is why we're talking about the other side of this, about the being open to other perceptions. So there were two things. One was community. And the other thing that we can trust in and even receive other perspective from ends up being God. And the thing about it is like with this, I talked about him last week and about his character as being one devoted to relation and relationship, and how that is like one of the grandest priorities to him. It's even why I brought up the thing with Jesus sweating blood and that whole thing, is because at the end of the day, what we find, again, like I was talking about last week, the whole thing about the story in the Bible, like when the overarching theme being the attempt of God to redeem us back to that same place as we were in the garden. Essentially just trying to bring us back to a place of being close to him, being near him, and him being a part of our lives. And the thing within all of this is that when it comes down to trust, the Bible is full of stories, full of quotes, even times where Jesus specifically says, don't worry about these things, they'll be taken care of. But to be more specific, there are plenty of times where when we talk about, having that perception that basically only trusts ourselves and our perspective, we find ourselves in a difficult spot, and sometimes we need an outside perspective to even see. And the thing about it is that when we talk about God, he does have a perspective that's very, very, very different, one from us, and two, even from a community. See, sometimes what happens with communities is they'll get into kind of like these group think mindsets, and it doesn't matter what kind of community you're in. I've seen it in, a lot of churches. I've seen it in prophetic groups where it's all people that hear from God, and then they start to all hear the same thing, and it might be something that's even completely opposed to anything that Jesus himself said in the scriptures, but because they all agree with it, they think that it must be true. So this can happen. And it's why why it's so important that there's kind of this third man in terms of where we're kind of finding truth and what we can trust in. And I know that it can seem problematic to try to discern from a collective instead of just, this is what I believe and feel, so I'm going to stick to this. But it can also save you a lot of grief and a lot of pain and a lot of anguish and a lot of anxiety. The thing of it is in terms of even other gods and things like that, I've talked before, I feel like I've had to talk a lot over the last couple of weeks about my past with Satanism and my experiences with demons. And even just the other day, I had God reminding me of some of the gods that I've met personally. And there were 4, Baal, Moloch, Aphrodite, and Krishna. And the thing of it was for each one of them, they hold those names, but they were just demons.
Taking credit for being gods.
Right. And that ended up being the thing, and they represented a lot of what those gods revolved around. And that was the thing that was really interesting about them, was their character and kind of what they held on to and believed in. And even just to give some kind of credence to that and what it felt like to know them or experience them was, I think Moloch was by far the most uncomfortable. He had that same kind of feeling. You know how sociopaths have some element of charm to them at least. When you meet them, they'll talk to you, and even though once you start running into the emotional stuff, you find those kind of dark patches, they don't come across as uncomfortable all the time unless you have a really strong intuition or sense on them. But imagine that kind of person without that character quality, where all you feel is how uncomfortable they feel, almost like they're looking at you like you're prey. That was a lot of how that one felt. And Aphrodite was handsy, and that's all I'm going to say. The point is, those experiences helped kind of give an understanding of these different gods and what they represent. And even just the reality that they're, I've talked in the past about different religions and different gods and how there are powers there. And they are backed by spirits and by forces. The thing of it is people don't gravitate towards these beliefs based purely off of nothing. There's always somebody that has to have something concrete to hold on to that they can then turn around and believe in. So they'll look for that spirit, that god, whatever, to prove themselves before they'll actually step in. And then once they have that experience, they can become some of the most vocal advocates for that particular god or religion. But at the same time, with each of those particular ones, just like any demon, faith in them and anything that you ask for comes with a cost. And the thing of it is that in a lot of ways it kind of puts us back into that same place of a lot of people in other religions, just to be fair, they end up in that same place of where their belief in this thing is directly correlated to what they have to do. And that ends up being the funny thing about God when we talk about him, is that, even though there's this prevailing mindset like we were talking about earlier, where a lot of the church believes in what they can do, and that's going to earn them favor with God, or that's going to earn them a place in heaven, or different things like that. Specifically talking about how, they trust in the Bible and the laws that it has, and therefore that their effort curries them favor. But the thing about God being a relational being, and where we find him being very, very different, is like I can talk about experiences not only for myself, but also where I've had to talk to other people, where they've heard things from God, and He's told them to do things like, hey, just rest, or hey, relax. Because everybody goes to God saying, what do you want me to do? And I've known a lot of people who have been met with, I want you to just sit here, or I want you to just talk to me. And I know from my own experience, having him do that to me was very frustrating, because I had that same mindset of, I have to go do stuff for you. But in reality, but I still remember him distinctly saying at one point, like, the one that comes right to mind is when he was just like, I just want you to sit with me. And I was just like, oh, so do you want something? You want to talk about something? He's like, no, just sit.
Just chill, dude.
Yeah. I'm just like, what do you mean just sit? You want me to just sit here with you? Yeah. Yeah. It's weird. It's weird. It's uncomfortable. So I had a really hard time with that. But it's one of those things where, you know, I've never found that with other spirits. They always had something that they wanted, even if it was for a moment. You know, in my past when I was working with demons, they always had something, even if it was just to sit. It was to talk about something, to learn about something, to do, and so that I could go do something for them later. Whereas with God, it's not necessarily about that. It's purely just about developing the relationship further. The same way that when you're going through something hard, you might just sit with one of your friends. You don't talk because there's nothing to say. So you just sit and know that you're not alone. And I think that ends up being the thing with him, is that he understands that more than anybody else. You know, when we read the stories in the Bible about whether it's Jesus' experiences or even reading the prophets when God's expressing so much anger and frustration at the Israelites for turning against him for different reasons. You know, whether it's that they were worshiping other gods or sacrificing their own children or doing all these different things, and he was just baffled by their decision. There was always this point of just him trying to be close to them and wanting the best for them. So, one of the things here is that when we talk about God and his character, there's something there that can be trusted in terms of understanding that he is somebody that wants the best, not only for us, but for those involved around us. And sometimes that means you have to humble yourself a little bit, because maybe you think that you're right, or you think that your way is correct, and maybe you need to stop for a moment and kind of check yourself. And again, we go back to that point about it being okay to have your stable ground be ripped up for a moment. You know, one of the things that I was given this week was, there was a sermon that Heather and I were listening to, and the guy was talking about soil, and we talked about soil a couple weeks ago, and about the way that soil has to be tilled. And you know, anybody that does farming knows that, or has farmed, knows that it doesn't matter how many times you till that soil, you're going to keep running into rocks. It's like they just come up out of the ground. And the thing about it is that, you know, there's kind of this ongoing process of us growing and developing as people. And even then, living life, we end up finding new problems, and we react to those problems. And sometimes we don't react well. Sometimes we get hurt. Sometimes we get traumatized, even. And then that has to be dealt with, and that creates its own set of new obstacles, and that has to be worked out. And that's not to say that God put you in a relationship with that guy or that girl, or, you know, God made your parents the way that they are. That is to say that life is difficult, and there are people acting of their own volition in this world. And even though God won't control those people, or control you for that matter, he will be with you to help guide you through the damage and even bring the healing necessary for it. He will sit with you as you heal, or he will heal you. There's a lot of possibility in there. And there's a lot of stuff that depends on the circumstance. Sometimes people need the slow heal as opposed to the quick, miraculous, crazy, Holy Spirit melted metal out of their arm type of thing. Sometimes they need the slow process of having their anxiety cured through learning slowly that they're safe, or their depression healed by knowing that they're loved. So the thing of it is, though, is like in the context of everything talked about, you know, as we grow and transform and move forward, there was one verse that God gave me to go over and just to kind of like highlight the truth of, you know, trust in him and what that looks like. And it's out of Matthew 14. But it's the story when Jesus walked on the water and had Peter come out to join him on the water. And the thing about it is that there's a little caveat with it. A lot of times the story's told in terms of Jesus walked on the water and he said to Peter, "Hey, come out with me." And then Peter came out, and then when Peter looked around, he sunk. But the truth of the story is a little different. In verse 27, it starts, "But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid.'" They were in the middle of a storm, and when the disciples saw him walking on water, they thought it was a ghost and kind of panicked. Peter replied, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You've little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" When they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. So those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The thing that I was given to highlight in this story is not that Peter was called out, it was that he asked to be called out. He said, "If it's you, then tell me to come." And there was a trust there. Peter recognized that if this was Jesus, then he could walk in this way. He could do this thing too. It's an interesting thing to consider, but the importance of it is in knowing that the thing that God calls us into is a very different kind of existence in this world, one that's not necessarily bound by it. And I don't mean that in terms of the crazy miraculous stuff, even though there's validity to that. What I do mean, though, is that even in terms of just the way that we exist and the way that we live can be very, very different from what we're accustomed to, from what the world says we're supposed to be accustomed to, outside of those groupthinks, outside of perception, outside of all these different things. Because in this place, there is the hope of something very different and something truly permanent happening in terms of transforming as a person. You know, we've all had experience with Christians who pretended to be better than they were. Sorry, I had to bite my tongue for a moment. The thing is that we've all had those experiences with those people. And the thing that happens with that is it kind of reinforces this idea that maybe that's all there is to this. It's just, you know, a book and some rules, and we do our best to follow them if you're good at it. If you suck at it, you pretend to follow the rules and then be a crappy person outside of your church. I mean, there's nothing quite like dealing with somebody who's super arrogant, petulant, and childish, all while they have like a little WWJD bracelet on.
Gag me.
So.
Sorry, you're recording, right?
Fetish number 2.
It's fine. It's just one of those things, like, I've been there enough times myself. The thing is that, you know, it's easy to kind of be affirmed in that, but the thing that God represents and the thing that he tries to call us into is something that is real, and it's a real change if we're open to that. And even then, that's why that some of these things have to be broken down. If God has to break delusions, he'll break delusions in order for you to finally see him. If he has to wait for them to pass, if he has to wait for you to calm down, he'll wait for you to calm down until you can see him. If he has to burn his own book about him to get through to you, so that you can see him instead of this. Because one important thing is, I mean, even in the one other passage I was given that I forgot about till just now was the story of Cornelius in out of Acts. In essence, Peter was told to go talk to this Roman centurion and his family, if I remember correctly. Anyway, named Cornelius, and Peter was under the impression that Christianity was just for the Jews. But God corrected him on that, so he went and showed up to Cornelius' house, and with all these Romans, he prayed with them, and the Holy Spirit fell, and suddenly people were speaking in tongues and prophesying, and there was divine revelation and all this crazy stuff. There wasn't a Bible at that time. What people had, and even the reason why this was compiled and why it became or part of the reason, I should say, why it ended up becoming the major religion of Rome after decades of murdering people for believing in it. You know, it was a thing that there was something that real that people were experiencing, and something real that people were having happen as God met them, and they found, again, that same thing, where they had those real experiences that changed things. And suddenly these people were willing to die for something that they experienced and knew. It's because at the end of the day, they were met with God instead of a book about him. They were met with an experience instead of stories. And at the end of it all, this is the thing that God's going to end up like drawing people into more and more. It's not about the rules. It's about the truth. And that's something that we can have trust in and believe in, because it will keep happening again and again and again. However he has to get through to us, he'll keep drawing us back to him over and over and over again. Because going back to that point about relationship and his desire for it, you know, it's a funny concept when you talk about heaven and hell and everything revolving around that, because there are so many different stigmas. But to paint a clear picture of heaven and why it is the way it is, God wants to keep you forever. Like, he looks at you as a person and sees all of your qualities and everything about you and has determined that you are somebody that he wants to keep forever. So he's going to try to get your attention so that maybe you'll come to know him and maybe you'll see that there's something there worth keeping. And yeah, there's change that comes with that because there's a lot of stuff that we carry from the world. And yeah, there are some people that won't go because, you know, for all of God's infinite wisdom and strength and power and all those things, he's not going to force anybody to love him. And if they don't want to love him, if they can't love him, if they hate him, there isn't really a place for that. He already had somebody decide that he hated him. And then he took a bunch of his angels with him and came down here and then convinced lots of other people to hate him too. So there we have Satan and that whole story and the gist of it. So, in this thing talking about trust, talking about belief, there is a place for us to believe in ourselves, yes. But it shouldn't be the end-all be-all. There's a place for us to trust in other people and to hope that they won't let us down. And yeah, you'll be disappointed sometimes. But there's also an opportunity to have those fears and that damage be healed by relationships with people who legitimately do care about you. And that you can legitimately care about as well. And something real can grow there. And sometimes they'll help you out of those places when you get stuck in delusions. And sometimes you'll help them out of places where they get stuck in delusions. Because it's a give and take type of thing. And third, there's a place to know God and to trust in him, because at the end of the day, he's always going to carry you across that water. And even when you get afraid and sink, he's still going to take care of you. And he's just going to keep pulling you back because he wants you. And he wants you to know him. And even though we can talk about all the unapproachability and all this other stuff, it doesn't matter. Because what matters is that he wants you to know as much of him as you can. The Bible's full of stories about people who knew God. The world is full of people right now who know God. At the very least, they know enough to know that he's good and that he's got your back. So within those three things, there's a lot of opportunity to kind of learn and grow and see and transform and to trust in things that are not always just incumbent on you to shoulder burdens. And that's what I got.